Please! My wife needs help, right now! Help her! She's not breathing! Doctor, please, hurry!
Rain fell hard over the city that night, hammering against the windshield as Ethan Carter carried his wife through the sliding doors of the emergency room. Naomi Brooks was folded against his chest, her face pale, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping the collar of his jacket like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Nurses rushed forward with a gurney, shouting numbers and questions Ethan barely understood, and for a moment the entire hospital seemed to fold itself around the two of them. He believed, in that instant, that this was simply food poisoning, a bad reaction, something that would pass by morning. He had no idea that in less than 1 hour, the same hallway would be filled with bodyguards in black suits, a convoy of armored vehicles, and a woman powerful enough to make hospital administrators tremble. He had no idea that the woman he loved, the woman who painted small canvases in their cramped apartment and cooked pasta on Tuesday nights, was the sole heir to a fortune worth more than $1 trillion. 7 years earlier, Ethan and Naomi had met on an ordinary rainy afternoon in a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the community college, where Ethan was finishing his engineering degree. She had spilled coffee on his notebook and apologized so sincerely, so warmly, that he forgot to be annoyed. From that day forward, their lives braided together in a way that felt inevitable, unhurried, and completely without pretense. They moved into a modest 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, the kind with a leaking faucet and a radiator that groaned all winter, and neither of them ever complained. Ethan worked as a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant, spending long hours on the floor among machines that never stopped humming, while Naomi painted commissioned portraits and small landscapes that she sold at local markets. To anyone who knew them, they looked like any young couple building a life from nothing, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. What no one knew, what not even Ethan suspected after 7 years of marriage, was that Naomi had walked away from an empire. She had been born into the Brooks family, a lineage whose name sat quietly behind global shipping routes, pharmaceutical patents, and real estate holdings that spanned 4 continents. Her grandmother, Victoria Brooks, sat at the head of that empire, a woman whose decisions could move markets with a single signature. But Naomi had chosen, at the age of 25, to disappear from that world entirely, to take nothing but a small inheritance from her late parents and vanish into an ordinary life where no one would ever look at her and calculate her net worth instead of her heart. She never spoke of her family. When Ethan asked, gently, over dinner one evening, about her parents and her childhood, she only smiled and told him she was no longer connected to any of that. He never pushed further, because he respected the walls she built, and because he loved her exactly as she was in front of him, without needing to know what lay behind her. They had been trying, quietly, to save enough money to start a family. Ethan picked up overtime shifts whenever the plant offered them, and Naomi took on extra portrait commissions even when her wrists ached from holding a brush too long. They wanted stability first, a nursery that wasn't also a storage closet, a savings account that wasn't perpetually near zero. Ethan often apologized for what he couldn't give her, for the vacations they never took and the jewelry he could never afford. And every single time, Naomi would take his face in her hands and tell him that she had never once felt poor beside him. She meant it more than he could possibly understand. She had once owned closets full of designer clothing she never wore, and bank accounts with more zeros than she could recite from memory. And she had traded all of it for the simple, aching joy of being loved for nothing but herself. Her phone would sometimes ring with numbers she never answered, calls that made her excuse herself to the balcony or the bathroom, her voice dropping low and tense before she returned with a practiced smile. Ethan noticed, of course, but he assumed they were relatives from a difficult past, people she had chosen to leave behind for reasons that were hers alone to carry. He never asked to see her phone. He never once doubted her. In a world where suspicion often poisons even the strongest marriages, Ethan Carter had built his entire understanding of Naomi on trust, and that trust, unshaken and unquestioned, would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Their apartment, though small, carried the particular warmth of 2 people who had chosen it deliberately, rather than settled for it out of necessity. Naomi had painted the kitchen walls a soft shade of yellow herself, standing on a wobbly step stool, while Ethan held it steady and teased her about the paint in her hair. On weekends, they walked to the farmer's market 3 streets over, buying vegetables they could barely afford, and pretending, for an hour or two, that they were the kind of couple who never worried about money at all. Ethan kept a small jar on top of the refrigerator, where loose coins collected slowly, a joke between them that one day it would fund a proper honeymoon, since their actual wedding had been a courthouse ceremony, followed by tacos from a truck outside. Naomi never once suggested they needed anything grander. She told him, more than once, that the tacos had tasted better than anything a five-star restaurant could have offered, because of the man sitting across from her. Ethan's coworkers at the plant occasionally teased him about how devoted he was, how he rushed home every evening instead of joining them at the bar down the street, how he still, after 7 years, brought Naomi flowers from the gas station on his way home some Fridays. He never felt embarrassed by their teasing, because nothing about his marriage felt like an obligation to him. It felt instead like the single steady thing in a life that had otherwise been defined by long shifts, tight budgets, and the quiet exhaustion of always trying to do slightly better than the month before. Naomi, for her part, adored the small rituals they had built together, the terrible instant coffee they drank every morning, the secondhand couch with the broken spring they had never gotten around to fixing, the late-night conversations about nothing in particular that stretched until one of them fell asleep mid-sentence. Neither of them realized how fragile that quiet happiness truly was, or how quickly a single night could threaten to unravel everything they had built. The night everything changed began like any other. Naomi had been quiet at dinner, pushing food around her plate, and by 9 in the evening she was doubled over on the kitchen floor, gripping her stomach with a pain so sudden and violent that Ethan dropped the dish towel and scooped her into his arms without a second thought. He did not bother with a coat. He did not bother locking the door properly behind him. He carried her down 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again, laid her gently in the passenger seat of their old sedan, and drove through the rain with his hazard lights blinking and his heart pounding harder than the engine. At the hospital, he filled out every form with shaking hands, answered every question the intake nurse asked, and refused to leave her side even when a nurse suggested he wait outside so they could run tests. He held Naomi's hand through every wave of pain, whispering that she was going to be fine, that he was right there, that he wasn't going anywhere. For nearly an hour, the two of them existed in that small curtained room as if nothing else in the world mattered. And for Ethan, nothing else did. He had never loved her more fiercely than in that sterile, fluorescent-lit room, watching her try to breathe through the pain and still manage to squeeze his hand reassuringly, as though she was the one comforting him. Then his phone rang. It was his plant supervisor, and the words that followed shattered the fragile calm of that room. A gas line had ruptured near the east wing of the factory, sparking a fire that was spreading toward a storage unit filled with pressurized canisters. Dozens of night shift workers were still inside, and the automatic shutdown system had failed. Ethan's specific knowledge of the plant's internal piping system, knowledge almost no one else on shift possessed, made him the only person who could guide the emergency crew to the manual valve before the entire wing went up in flame. He stood frozen for 3 full seconds, torn between the woman he loved and the lives of men he had worked beside for a decade. Naomi saw the conflict tear across his face before he even said a word, and she squeezed his hand with more strength than her weakened body should have allowed. She told him to go, that people needed him, that she would be fine, that this was just her stomach and nothing more. Ethan hesitated at the doorway, looking back at her one last time, promising her, promising himself, that he would return the moment the crisis was contained. He told her he loved her. She told him to hurry. Neither of them knew that this simple, desperate choice, made out of duty and love in equal measure, was about to detonate both of their lives. The instant the door swung shut behind him, something in Naomi's body gave way entirely, and the pain that had been sharp became unbearable, blooming into a darkness that swallowed her vision. A doctor rushing past the room noticed her collapse against the pillow, her monitor alarms screaming in a way that pulled 3 nurses running. Internal bleeding, the kind that required immediate surgical intervention, had been quietly building beneath the surface, masked by symptoms that looked, at first glance, like something far less dangerous. The medical team moved fast, but even as they worked, one nurse noticed something strange tucked into Naomi's emergency contact information, a name that made her pause and reach for a different phone entirely. That name, triggered a call that traveled through 3 layers of private security before it ever reached its destination. A protocol, I quote, a protocol built years earlier, and the protocol built years earlier by people who understood exactly how dangerous the world could be for someone carrying the Brooks family. Within 30 minutes, the ordinary chaos of a public hospital transformed into something the staff had only seen in movies. Black vehicles rolled into the ambulance bay in a tight, disciplined formation, their headlights cutting through the rain like blades. Men in dark suits stepped out first, sweeping the entrance with practiced eyes, followed by attorneys clutching leather folders, and finally, a helicopter's spotlight sweeping briefly across the rooftop before it found a place to land nearby. At the center of that storm walked Victoria Brooks, 62 years old, and carrying herself with the kind of authority that made hospital administrators abandon their desks to greet her personally. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, her coat immaculate despite the storm outside, and her eyes moved across the waiting room with cold, clinical precision. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every person in that lobby understood, without being told, that whoever this woman was, she controlled far more than the room she stood in. She walked directly to the nurse's station and asked only one question, quiet and razor-sharp. Where was her granddaughter's husband? A nurse, still catching her breath from the sudden influx of security personnel, explained as gently as she could that Mr. Carter had left roughly 40 minutes earlier due to an emergency at his workplace. Victoria's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes hardened into something colder. She walked into the recovery area, past protesting staff who quickly stepped aside once her attorneys produced the necessary authorizations, and found Naomi still groggy from the anesthesia, tubes running from her arm, her face pale against the white pillow. Victoria took her granddaughter's hand and asked her, softly this time, where her husband had gone. Naomi, still weak, still fighting through the fog of sedation, whispered that Ethan had left to save people, that lives had been in danger, that he had promised to come back. Victoria listened, but the explanation did not soften the suspicion already forming behind her calculated gaze. She had seen too many men chase fortunes disguised as love, had watched too many predators circle young women who thought they had found something real, and the timing of this particular absence struck her as convenient in a way she did not like. She smoothed Naomi's hair back from her forehead, told her to rest, and stepped outside the room with an expression that promised this matter was far from settled. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan stood in the wreckage of the factory's east wing, soaked in rain and sweat, his forearm scorched from a burst of flame he had barely dodged while manually sealing the ruptured valve. He had guided the emergency crew exactly where they needed to go, had physically pulled 2 younger workers away from a collapsing shelf of canisters, and had stayed until the fire marshal confirmed the danger had passed. His phone, forgotten in his jacket pocket through all of it, had died sometime during the chaos, its battery drained hours earlier by the frantic calls he'd made trying to reach coworkers before he even arrived. He had no way of knowing that his wife had nearly died on an operating table, while he was elbow-deep in twisted pipe fittings, saving strangers who would never know his name. It was nearly 3 in the morning by the time Ethan secured a ride back toward the hospital, borrowing a coworker's charger just long enough to see a screen full of missed calls and a single text message from an unknown number that simply read, "Come now." Panic gripped him immediately, and he ran the last 2 blocks in the rain, because his coworker's car had been blocked in by fire trucks. He burst through the same sliding doors he had carried Naomi through hours earlier, expecting relief, expecting to finally hold her again, expecting nothing more complicated than an apology for taking so long. Instead, he found 2 men in dark suits blocking the hallway to her room, arms crossed, faces unreadable, refusing to let him pass, without so much as an explanation. By morning, a story had already begun circulating that Ethan did not yet know existed. Damian Brooks, Naomi's cousin and Victoria's nephew, had been the first family member notified after Victoria's security team, and he had wasted no time shaping the narrative before Ethan ever had a chance to explain himself. Damian was 40 years old, sharply dressed, endlessly charming in boardrooms, and hungrier for control of the family fortune than anyone in the Brooks lineage would openly admit. He had spent years positioning himself as Victoria's most trusted advisor, waiting patiently for any crack in Naomi's carefully hidden life that he could widen into something useful. Ethan's disappearance from the hospital, however innocent the reason, was exactly the kind of crack he had been waiting for. Damien arrived at the hospital before dawn, offering Victoria comfort with one hand while quietly building a case against Ethan with the other. He suggested, in the softest and most concerned tone he could manufacture, that a man who abandoned his critically ill wife for any reason, no matter how urgent, revealed something troubling about his character. He reminded Victoria how much was at stake, how many predators had circled Naomi over the years once rumors of her identity leaked, how important it was to protect her, and by extension, the family's legacy, from anyone whose loyalty could not be proven beyond doubt. Victoria listened to every word, her jaw tight, her mind already turning toward investigation rather than compassion. She ordered her security team to compile a full background report on Ethan Carter by morning, leaving no detail unexamined. What neither Victoria nor Ethan yet understood was that Damien's concern was calculated theater, carefully constructed to keep suspicion aimed anywhere but at himself. He had, in fact, known for weeks that Naomi's location had been discovered by an old family rival, information he had quietly sold rather than reported, setting a chain of events into motion that he now intended to exploit fully. The gas leak at Ethan's factory had not been a random accident of aging infrastructure, though it would take considerable time before anyone thought to question that assumption. For now, the story spreading through the family's inner circle was simple, damning, and entirely one-sided. Ethan Carter had walked away from his dying wife, and no explanation he offered afterward could possibly be trusted. Ethan spent that morning demanding answers he could not get, pacing a hospital corridor while security guards, clearly following someone else's orders, refused to let him near Naomi's room. He tried calling her phone repeatedly, only to have the calls go straight to voicemail, since her device had been quietly confiscated by Victoria's staff as a precaution. He tried explaining himself to anyone who would listen, describing the factory fire, the trapped workers, the promise he had made to return. But the men blocking the hallway simply repeated that they were following instructions and nothing more. For the first time in his marriage, Ethan felt something he had never experienced with Naomi before: complete and total helplessness in the face of a world he did not understand. By the following afternoon, a video had begun circulating among Naomi's extended family and their private circle of associates. A video carefully edited to show only the worst possible version of events. It opened with Ethan carrying Naomi into the emergency room, cut immediately to a blurry shot of him walking briskly out of the building sometime later, and ended there, stripped of every moment in between where he had held her hand, filled out her paperwork, or promised to return. There was no footage of the factory fire, no mention of the lives he had saved, nothing to suggest any context beyond a husband, simply walking away from a hospital bed. Whoever had assembled the footage understood exactly how devastating a story could become once stripped of its truth. Damien had commissioned the edit personally, paying a private security contractor generously to isolate the most damning frames from hours of hospital camera footage while discarding everything that complicated the narrative he wanted told. He distributed it carefully, first to a few trusted members of the extended family circle, then, with practiced deniability, to a gossip contact who specialized in stories about wealthy families and their scandals. Within a day, whispers about Naomi Brooks and her negligent husband had begun spreading through circles Ethan didn't even know existed. Circles populated by people who had never met him, but had already decided, based on 90 seconds of footage, exactly who he was. He remained completely unaware that any of this was happening, still trapped in a hospital hallway, still begging for information about his wife. Victoria received the edited footage that evening, watching it in silence in the private office she had commandeered on the hospital's top floor. Her expression did not change as the video played, but something inside her, some final thread of doubt, finally snapped. She had spent decades protecting her family from men who wanted access to their fortune more than they wanted love, and she had convinced herself, watching those grainy seconds on repeat, that Ethan Carter was simply the latest and most convincing of them all. She gave the order that evening. Ethan Carter was not to be allowed anywhere near her granddaughter, not in the hospital, not at their apartment, not anywhere, until she personally determined otherwise. Security escorted him from the building that same night, and Ethan stood outside in the rain, staring up at a building he could no longer enter, utterly bewildered by how quickly his entire world had turned against him. 3 days passed before Victoria agreed to meet Ethan face to face, summoning him not to the hospital, but to a private conference room in a downtown office tower he had never noticed before, despite passing it nearly every day on his way to work. He arrived in the same worn jacket he always wore, his hands raw from days of anxious pacing, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. Victoria sat at the head of a long glass table, flanked by 2 attorneys, a folder in front of her that Ethan correctly guessed contained every detail of his financial history, his employment records, and likely far more than that. She did not offer him a seat immediately, studying him instead the way one might study an animal whose intentions remained unclear. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, deliberate, entirely without warmth, and she told him plainly that she understood men like him, men who found their way into the lives of wealthy women and convinced themselves, or convinced everyone else, that their intentions were pure. She slid a check across the table, the number printed on it larger than anything Ethan had ever seen outside of a headline about lottery winners, and told him that this sum was his if he agreed, quietly and without contest, to end his marriage to Naomi immediately. She explained that Naomi would be cared for, that the family would ensure she recovered fully and lived comfortably, and that Ethan's presence in her life, given recent events, had become a liability the family could no longer tolerate. She expected gratitude, or at least quiet acceptance. She received neither. Ethan stared at the check for a long moment, long enough that one of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and then he slid it back across the polished glass without hesitation. He told Victoria, in a voice that shook slightly but did not waver in its meaning, that if she believed for even 1 second that he had married Naomi for money, then she had never actually known her granddaughter at all. He told her that he had left the hospital that night because a factory full of men, fathers and sons and brothers just like him, would have died if he hadn't, and that Naomi herself had been the one who told him to go. He told her that he had spent 3 days terrified out of his mind, not because he had lost access to a fortune he never knew existed, but because he had lost the ability to hold his wife's hand and know she was safe. Victoria said nothing for a long moment, her composure, for the first time in years, visibly cracking at the edges. Something in Ethan's voice, in the raw exhaustion behind his eyes, planted the first seed of doubt in Victoria's certainty, though she was far too disciplined to let it show in that room. She dismissed him coolly, telling him only that she would consider his words, and had her security escort him out of the building without further conversation. But that night, alone in her office, she replayed the factory fire timeline against the hospital's own security logs, cross-referencing timestamps she had previously ignored in her rush to judgment. The numbers told a story that did not match the video Damien had shown her, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Victoria Brooks allowed herself to wonder whether she had been looking at the wrong man entirely. Damien noticed the shift in his aunt's demeanor almost immediately, the subtle change in the questions she began asking her security team, the way she requested the full, unedited hospital footage rather than relying solely on what he had already provided. Panic, carefully hidden behind his usual composed exterior, began to build inside him as he realized his carefully constructed narrative might not survive close scrutiny. He doubled down instead, arranging quiet conversations with other family members, painting Ethan as increasingly dangerous, suggesting without evidence that Ethan might have orchestrated the factory incident himself as some elaborate excuse to escape the hospital. It was a reckless lie, born of desperation. But Damien had learned long ago that confident lies traveled faster than cautious truths. Unbeknownst to everyone in that family circle, Ethan had begun his own quiet investigation, driven not by suspicion, but by a stubborn refusal to accept that his marriage could be destroyed by something he didn't understand. He returned to the factory during his off hours, walking the scorched east wing with the plant's safety inspector, asking pointed questions about how exactly the gas line had ruptured in a system that had passed inspection only months earlier. The inspector, a careful man named Robert Hale who took his job seriously, admitted that the failure pattern looked unusual, more consistent with deliberate tampering than gradual wear. That single sentence changed everything for Ethan, transforming his confusion into something sharper, something closer to purpose. Ethan spent the following 2 weeks piecing together a timeline that felt increasingly impossible to ignore, cross-referencing security badge logs from the night of the explosion with maintenance records that had been quietly altered in the days beforehand. He discovered that someone with detailed knowledge of the plant's internal systems, knowledge that extended well beyond what any random saboteur could possess, had accessed the storage facility's control room less than an hour before the rupture occurred. When he finally tracked down the visitor log for that access point, the name recorded there belonged to a contractor whose payment records led, after several more days of careful digging, directly back to an account controlled by Damian Brooks. Ethan sat with that discovery for a long time, staring at the paper trail spread across their small kitchen table, understanding for the first time that the chaos consuming his marriage had never been an accident at all. During those same 2 weeks, Naomi's recovery progressed slowly, her body healing from surgery, while her heart struggled with something far harder to mend. Victoria's estate, sprawling and unfamiliar, felt more like a gilded holding cell than a place of comfort, filled with staff who addressed her formally and rooms too large to feel like home. She spent hours by the window, overlooking manicured gardens she had no interest in, thinking constantly of the small apartment she shared with Ethan, of the crooked picture frames and the couch with the broken spring, of a life that suddenly felt impossibly far away. Victoria checked on her daily, gentler now than she had been in years, though Naomi could sense the calculation still running quietly behind her grandmother's concerned expression. She missed Ethan with an ache that no amount of luxury around her could soften, and she began, slowly, to plan how she would find her way back to him regardless of what her family decided. He brought his findings to Naomi first, who had by then recovered enough to leave the hospital, though Victoria still kept her under close watch in a private estate outside the city. Naomi listened to everything Ethan had uncovered with growing horror, realizing that her own cousin had orchestrated an explosion that could have killed dozens of workers purely to manufacture a wedge between her and the husband she loved. She had always known Damien to be ambitious, occasionally cold, but she had never imagined him capable of something this calculated, this willing to sacrifice innocent lives for a larger share of a fortune he already benefited from generously. Together, they decided that scattered evidence would not be enough. They needed to expose everything at once, in front of the one audience Damien could never manipulate his way out of, the entire Brooks family council. Victoria had scheduled a quarterly family council meeting for the following week, a gathering that brought together every major stakeholder in the Brooks family holdings, board members, attorneys, and relatives whose combined influence shaped decisions worth billions of dollars. Naomi requested permission to attend, despite her grandmother's reservations about her health, insisting that something urgent needed to be addressed before the council adjourned. Ethan spent the days leading up to the meeting compiling everything into a single, undeniable presentation. The maintenance records, the visitor logs, the payment trail, and finally, after considerable effort and the help of a forensic video specialist, Robert Hale, had recommended, the complete and unedited hospital security footage that had somehow never made it into Damien's carefully curated video. The council meeting began exactly as Damien expected, with polite formalities and routine business updates that bored most of the room into quiet inattention. He had positioned himself near the head of the table, close enough to Victoria to appear indispensable, and when the topic finally turned toward recent family matters, he seized the opportunity to publicly humiliate Ethan in front of everyone present. He described Ethan as an opportunist who had abandoned his dying wife, questioned his motives with theatrical concern, and suggested that the family formally distance itself from him before his presence caused further damage to their reputation. Several board members nodded along, swayed by weeks of carefully seeded rumors. Ethan sat quietly through all of it, his jaw tight, waiting for his moment with a patience that surprised even Naomi beside him. When Damien finally paused, clearly satisfied with the reaction he had generated around the table, Ethan stood and asked, calmly, whether the council would be interested in seeing the complete hospital footage rather than the 90-second clip that had been circulating. A murmur rippled through the room as he connected a laptop to the main display screen, and the unedited video began to play, showing every moment Damien's version had conveniently erased. It showed Ethan carrying Naomi through the emergency room doors, filling out her paperwork with trembling hands, holding her through wave after wave of pain. And finally, the moment he received the call about the factory fire, his obvious anguish visible even through grainy security footage, as he made an impossible choice, the room fell completely silent. Ethan continued, laying out the maintenance records showing signs of deliberate tampering, The visitor log placing an unauthorized contractor at the storage facility less than an hour before the explosion, and the payment trail connecting that contractor directly to an account bearing Damien's name. He explained, in a voice that grew steadier with every sentence, how the timing of the explosion had been engineered specifically to pull him away from the hospital, creating the exact vulnerability that allowed the edited footage to look so damning in isolation. Naomi rose beside him, her voice trembling but resolute, confirming every detail and adding her own account of how Damien had pressured Victoria's security team in the hours following the incident. Around the table, expressions shifted from skepticism to horror as the full scope of the deception became impossible to deny. Victoria sat frozen at the head of the table, watching decades of careful judgment about her own family collapse in real time. She had trusted Damien's counsel completely, had allowed his whispered concerns to override her own instincts about the man her granddaughter had chosen to marry, and now she understood with painful clarity how thoroughly she had been manipulated. Her eyes moved to Ethan, standing tall despite everything he had endured, and then to Naomi, tears streaming silently down her face, as the truth finally, fully surfaced in front of the entire family. Damien attempted to protest, to claim the evidence had been fabricated, but his voice cracked under the weight of a room that had already stopped believing him. Security, at Victoria's sharp command, escorted Damien from the building before he could say another word, his carefully constructed reputation dissolving in the span of a single afternoon. Victoria remained in the conference room long after the other council members filed out, staring at the evidence spread across the table, at the photograph of Ethan pulling a young worker away from collapsing shelves that Robert Hale had included in his supplementary report. She thought of every accusation she had leveled against a man who had done nothing but choose, in an impossible moment, to save lives he had no obligation to save. The weight of her mistake settled over her slowly, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria Brooks felt genuinely ashamed. The following day, Victoria requested a private meeting with Ethan, this time without attorneys, without security posturing, without the cold formality that had defined their first encounter. She apologized, plainly and without excuse, admitting that she had allowed fear and old wounds from her own past to cloud her judgment about a man who had proven, through actions rather than words, exactly the kind of character he possessed. She told him about her own late husband, a man who had once walked away from a business opportunity worth millions to sit beside her hospital bed after a difficult surgery, and how she had spent years afterward measuring every man who entered her family against that impossible standard. Ethan listened without bitterness, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, how deeply fear could distort even the most careful judgment. Damien's actions, once fully investigated by the family's legal team and eventually local authorities, resulted in the permanent removal of his name from the family trust and an ongoing criminal investigation into the factory sabotage that had endangered dozens of innocent lives. He disappeared from public life almost entirely afterward, his once promising future within the Brooks empire reduced to court dates and quiet disgrace. Victoria formally addressed the extended family and board, correcting every falsehood Damien had spread, and publicly acknowledging Ethan's courage in choosing to save the factory workers, despite the devastating personal cost it nearly caused him. The apology, delivered in front of the same council that had once condemned him, felt to Ethan less like vindication and more like simple relief that the truth had finally caught up to reality. That evening, alone with Naomi in the quiet of her grandmother's estate, Ethan finally asked the question that had been building inside him since the night everything unraveled. He asked her why she had never told him, not once in 7 years of marriage, about the family she came from, the fortune that waited behind every unanswered phone call, the entire hidden world she had walked away from, to be with him. Naomi took his hands in hers and explained, her voice steady, despite the vulnerability in her words, that she had spent her early 20s surrounded by people who claimed to love her while calculating her net worth behind polite smiles. She told him that when she met him, spilling coffee across his notebook in that small shop years ago, she had made a choice to protect the one thing money could never buy her, certainty that someone loved her simply for being herself. Ethan sat with her words for a long moment, processing not just what she had said, but everything it meant about the woman he had built an entire life beside, without ever fully knowing her. He was not angry about the money. had never once cared about the money, not even when Victoria's check sat untouched on that glass table weeks earlier. What settled heavily in his chest instead was the realization that Naomi had carried an enormous secret alone for years, protecting him from a truth that might have changed how the world treated their marriage, absorbing that weight entirely by herself. He told her, quietly, that the only thing he was truly upset about was that she had faced that burden without letting him share it, that a marriage was supposed to mean neither of them carried anything alone. Naomi wept then, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being fully known and fully accepted in the same breath. In the months that followed, life slowly found a new rhythm, though it bore little resemblance to the quiet anonymity Ethan and Naomi had once treasured. Ethan returned to the factory once repairs were complete, insisting on keeping his job despite Victoria's repeated offers to place him at the head of one division or another within the family's vast holdings. He told her plainly that he had spent his entire life building competence with his own two hands, and he had no interest in trading that identity for a title he hadn't earned, no matter how generous the offer. Victoria, who had learned a great deal about character over the preceding months, respected his decision more than she would have respected acceptance. Naomi, watching him lace up his work boots each morning exactly as he always had, told him with a soft smile that this stubborn insistence on staying himself was precisely why she had chosen him in the first place. Together, Ethan and Naomi decided to use a portion of the family's resources, now openly available to them both, to create something meaningful rather than simply comfortable. They established a foundation dedicated to supporting factory workers injured on the job, funding better safety equipment and emergency medical care for facilities that couldn't otherwise afford it. They expanded the mission to include hospital funding in underserved communities, ensuring that families without connections or fortune could still receive the kind of urgent care that had once saved Naomi's life. They also created technical scholarships for young engineers, students who reminded Ethan of himself years earlier, working overtime shifts and studying late into the night, with nothing but determination and a dream of something more. Victoria, in a gesture that surprised the entire board, formally transferred full control of the family trust to Naomi during a ceremony attended by every major stakeholder in the company's history. She explained to the gathered crowd that her granddaughter had proven, through the hardest possible test, exactly the kind of judgment and integrity the family's legacy required to survive another generation. Naomi accepted the responsibility with a steadiness that surprised even herself, understanding now that hiding from her identity had never truly protected her, and that owning it fully, alongside a husband who loved her without condition, was its own kind of freedom. For the first time in her adult life, she felt no need to disguise who she was or where she came from. At the press conference that followed the transfer of leadership, reporters gathered eagerly, expecting the usual, carefully worded statements about corporate strategy and shareholder value. Naomi surprised them all instead, by introducing Ethan directly, her hand resting firmly in his as she stood before the cameras without a trace of hesitation. She told the room that this was her husband, a man the entire world had briefly and unfairly misjudged, a man who had never once abandoned her in his heart, even during the single night circumstances had forced him away from her hospital bed. She told them that true partnership meant standing beside someone through misunderstanding, through public scrutiny, through every test that fortune and fear could throw at two people who simply wanted to build a life together. As the cameras flashed and questions rose from every corner of the room, Ethan stood quietly beside his wife, no longer the anxious, uncertain man who had once felt unworthy of love, that came without financial ease attached to it. He understood now that the value of what he shared with Naomi had never depended on numbers in an account or a name printed on a corporate letterhead. It had depended entirely on the choice they made, over and over, to trust each other, even when the world outside their marriage tried desperately to convince them otherwise. Naomi squeezed his hand once, a small, private gesture meant only for him, and in that touch he felt every ounce of the certainty he had once feared losing forever. Months later, on a quiet evening with no cameras and no board meetings, Ethan and Naomi returned to the hospital, where their story had nearly ended before it truly began. They walked hand in hand through the same sliding doors, past the same nurse's station, retracing steps that once carried nothing but panic and fear between them. The hallway looked different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the meaning attached to it had transformed entirely from the site of their darkest misunderstanding into a quiet monument of everything they had rebuilt since. Naomi paused at the threshold, looking back at Ethan with the same warmth she had carried since the very first day they met in a small coffee shop years earlier. Ethan pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers the way he had done 100 times before, in good moments and terrible ones alike, and told her simply that he would choose her again in every version of their story, wealthy or ordinary, hidden or fully known. Naomi smiled, tears gathering but never falling, and told him that she had never needed him to choose the fortune, only ever needing him to choose her. Outside, the rain that had once poured down on the worst night of their marriage had given way to a clear evening sky, stars scattered faintly above the city they had chosen to keep calling home. They walked out together, no longer strangers to each other's deepest truths, no longer separated by secrets or suspicion or the terrible weight of misunderstanding. Behind them, the hospital stood exactly as it always had, unremarkable from the outside, indistinguishable from countless other buildings scattered across the city. But for Ethan and Naomi, it would always mark the place where love had been tested by fire, by fortune, and by the darkest kind of deception, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, emerged stronger for having survived it. Their marriage, built originally on modest apartments and shared sacrifice, had weathered a storm neither of them could have imagined, and had come out the other side carrying something even more valuable than the $1 trillion fortune that had briefly threatened to tear them apart. It carried proof, undeniable and hard-won, that some things, once truly built on trust, simply cannot be bought, stolen, or broken by anything the world decides to throw against them. Years later, people who met the Carters for the first time rarely guessed the truth behind their story. Since Ethan still wore the same style of worn work jacket to family gatherings, and Naomi still preferred painting in a quiet corner over standing beneath a spotlight. They kept their original apartment for a long while, after everything settled, unable to part with the small yellow kitchen where their marriage had first taken root, eventually turning it into a quiet retreat they visited whenever the demands of the foundation grew too loud. Victoria, in the years that followed, became something closer to a grandmother than a chairwoman in Ethan's life. Often arriving unannounced with groceries she insisted on cooking herself, clumsy and out of practice, but determined to make up for lost time. The scholarship program they built together grew steadily, sending dozens of young engineers through school each year, many of them working the very same kind of overtime shifts Ethan once worked, carrying the same quiet hope he once carried. Naomi often told the story to those scholarship recipients personally, not as a cautionary tale about wealth or deception, but as a reminder that character revealed itself most clearly in the moments no one was watching. She spoke of a rainy night, a ringing phone, and a husband who chose to run toward danger because people needed him, never once realizing what waited on the other side of that choice. She spoke of the long, uncertain days that followed, the fear, the accusations, the crushing silence of a locked hospital door, and how none of it had been enough to break something built on 7 years of honest love. Ethan, listening from the back of the room during those talks, never grew tired of hearing her tell it, because every retelling reminded him of exactly how close they had come to losing each other, and exactly how grateful he remained that they hadn't. In the end, their story became less about the fortune that had once separated them, and more about the simple, stubborn truth that had ultimately reunited them, that love, tested honestly, does not break. It bends, it bruises, it survives, and if it is real enough, it always finds its way back home.